Good afternoon. I was going to say good morning. Oh God, it's been a long day. It's been a long day. I'm Danya.
I'm Brian, and welcome to Genealogy Adventures.
Yes, yes. How are you guys today? We hope everything is well. I'm in the process of setting up the little watch party, so pay me no attention. Brian, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
That's good. Well, today's show is one that we've been trying to get.
For about a year.
Yes, for about a year. So we are going to introduce her right now. Her name is Dr. Ellen Fernandez-Sacco, and she does research on Caribbean and no, am I wrong? Caribbean
It's mostly Puerto Rican, but I do
It's
I
Puerto
do
Rican.
some
and
Caribbean
Hispanic
stuff.
and
Yeah,
Puerto Rican genealogy. So, hi, Ellen. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks for having me on.
We're having some sound trouble. 1 second.
Sure,
Oh,
Oh,
there it
you're
is.
back.
There it is.
you
You're
got
back.
it back.
Yep.
Okay, good.
All right. So, how are you today?
I'm doing fine. I'm
That's
doing fine.
that's great.
Just
That's
thinking about the topic and the massiveness of it too.
yes, it is. It is massive, and Brian and I have really been interested in it because we both have Caribbean um,
Connection.
descent
Hmm.
connections. So,
hmm
but we've never known how to actually jump in and get started on researching it. So, we're really happy for you to be on this show today.
Sure. Thanks.
That and the fact that it's a huge, as you said, it's a huge topic. I don't really see it covered terribly often, not in the main kind of genealogy channels.
I was getting ready to say something. Um,
I put it diplomatically, I think.
yeah, yeah. So Ellen, I'm the one that got to stop myself from saying stuff, and Brian is the diplomatic one. So if I kind of cut back, it's just because I need to make sure I'm not saying nothing wrong. But yeah. So Brian, you want to start?
Okay, so if you'd like to just familiarize the audience with kind of who you are, how you got into genealogy, and a little bit more about your speciality.
Yeah. Well, I was born in New York. I'm from the South Bronx and Queens, and then the other boroughs as well. Uh, moving around New York before I finally moved to California, and then now live in Florida. I have a doctorate. It's in art history, and and I focus on 18th century museums and representations of people of color, and looking at indigenous representations in early American museums in the late 18th century in the United States. Um, so I kind of went from that and kind of took those research skills into genealogy. And one of the things that really I grew up with was listening to my mom tell me about her life in this rural town on the west side of Puerto Rico. And my dad wasn't born in Puerto Rico; he was born in New York City. And so I'm Puerto Rican on both sides, but it's two different migrations. The 1940s versus the 1920s of my paternal grandparents. So my mom would tell me these stories, and this is some time ago. And then at a certain point, I started to write it down. And this will put some age on me here. Um, the 1910 census was just released. I mean, we didn't have ancestry and all of these resources that we have today. So then you start with the 1910 census, and I found out what my grandmother's maiden name was. We didn't even have that information. So things like that. And I just kept building on with that over time. And then, things like message boards. And then I have a couple of groups that I run, Sociedad Ancestros Mocanos, which I've had since 2005, that I've run with a group of cousins interested in the genealogy of Puerto Rico, Northwest, and the island. And now, it's like a Facebook group. And then also I kept at it. So it's been about 21 years now. I'm a member of Black Progen Live. And that's given me an opportunity to kind of expand into a lot of some different areas of research. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity too. Um, and I just keep working away on certain topics. And one of the things that I've been really focused on is the history of slavery in Puerto Rico, and kind of like how did that hit my own personal history, because I kind of have it from both sides. I have enslaver and enslaved is in there. And so a lot of my work that I've been doing lately is kind of focused on kind of that. And you could see kind of a variety of things that I've done on my website. It's not just, even though it's Latino genealogy, it's not just Latino genealogy. I mean, I comment on podcasts or, other people's research or topics or, show themes, things like that. So I encourage people to check it out.
Okay.
Thank you for that. I just want to take a quick check with our producer to make sure that we're streaming on Facebook.
Yeah. Yeah. It's moving slow.
Okay.
It's moving slow on both ends.
It's lagging.
Yeah, it's lagging. So
I'm about to restart it to make sure.
okay. Yeah. So I know we have our regular listeners on Listen Vision Live, and we're really happy about that. We normally have people we have a live stream that goes to Facebook, but sometimes it's just a mess, and I do want to apologize for that. But I wanted to know what started you on your research and journey. Every genealogist has something that happened that made them say, okay, I'm going to look into it. So what started you on your journey?
It's I think in part my grandparents passed away like probably 10 to 15 years before I was born. So that kind of left me with something wondering about where some of my roots are from. And I grew up with my paternal grandparents around, but not my maternal grandparents. So I think that kind of like launched a lot of questions for me,
Okay. All right. So, okay, well, let's jump into the meat of this. Because you just made this comment saying that you had to start with the 1910 census.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, was that the first time that you were finding your family on the census record? Were you able to find them backwards? Like, how do you?
It was because it was at that time, and it's like and I'm talking in the 90s or something, in late 90s. It's not now. But yeah, that was like the first record set that was kind of released. So in order to get information, you're either working with, family documents or things like that. I didn't have access to that. So it was a lot of listening to a lot of oral history and then trying to piece out of that, try to get names and try to get locations, and then, actually go there to visit, spend time on the island too.
Okay.
So, what would you say are some of the unique challenges and barriers to actually doing Caribbean and Hispanic research?
Well, first off, we're talking about a region that's like 1 million square miles, and it's like 7,000 islands. And then that gets clustered. I mean, somebody wrote about this recently, that it's 13 sovereign nations and 12 dependent territories. And so with all of that, and you can't even just talk about the islands. I mean, I've always looked at the Caribbean as kind of like, it's the whole thing. It's not really, it's everywhere that water touches. Mm-hmm. There's that potential for people to have been trafficked through there. And when we look at the start of the slave trade, the international slave trade, it hit Puerto Rico and it hit the Dominican Republic first. And, Native peoples were sent all over. When people were colonizing North America, they sent people from there to the Caribbean. And so then Africans were brought in 1538. So then you already have a mix. You already have something going on that isn't one thing or one specific place. And I think that's something that the way that education has gone on in the past is kind of almost taught us like in bubbles, when actually there's a lot of interconnections, and that's also kind of makes you like, oh my gosh, that's like so much to deal with, but actually you just begin with yourself. It's like, basic genealogical practice, and then you try to find those hints and get those areas or those clues to get you back to a specific location. And a lot of times we know, and sometimes we don't know.
Well, that's actually a really good point, because again, thinking about kind of colonialism, a lot of the major Western European powers had their own territories within the Caribbean. So I would imagine that's going to impact records, how well they were kept, whether they still exist.
Exactly.
Even the language that you need to understand. Because if I go to Puerto Rico, I'm going to assume that most of the records, if not all of the old ones, are going to all be in Spanish.
They will be, but then, your biggest friend is Family Search. because they have such a tremendous collection of record sets in there. And then you use things like the word lists if you don't know the language, and then you start to pick up terms. And some of the things we look for across records is kind of the same thing. So so you start small and just keep building up over time. Because a lot of this stuff is really like kind of a boilerplate once it gets started, some of it is. And then you can build up a contextual knowledge, but you can do that once you have a better idea what's going on with your own family. So that's like one of the really things I encourage people to do is to record your family history to, get an idea where were they, where did they go, and also like if you've got Puerto Rican ancestry, you don't even have to go to Puerto Rico. You could have had two people meet up in Brooklyn. It just doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be a specific location. Like if I look at my own DNA, it looks like it went through a fan. I just got like everything in there, but there's not really necessarily that. I've had ancestors that people that came to the island, but it's not like everything's going to necessarily lead me off either. So that's when you have a better sense of where your how your family history is going. That's something to work with. And also, people came from the south. Like there was an 18th century record that I looked at for Aguadilla, which is a town on the west side of the island, and it's the late 1700s, early 1800s, and it says that the person was an enslaved man from the South, from the American South, and was getting married in the church there. So we know that this traffic brings people, the slave traffic had brought people all over and created all kinds of different kinds of connections and interactions. Like 10 million people swept up in a forced migration, and then half of them wind up in Latin America. So these things it's kind of remarkable,
Wow.
when we look at this. And that's not to say that we can get that whole thing back, but there's things you can do at least to understand what happened.
So that's going to be something for us to factor in, because we think about our ancestors being brought from Barbados and Jamaica to
Right.
South Carolina.
Right.
I never really thought that it could go the other way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That people from
Yeah.
here being sent there.
Was actually sent there. That's a good thought. So because we do know that we have some family members that actually were shipped from places like Barbados and Jamaica into South Carolina. How are the records in those areas? Like, and especially with the hurricane.
In Puerto Rico.
Yeah, in Puerto Rico.
It's
was
not
a lot
easy.
lost?
You really have to explore a lot of different record sets and see it, and also get into people's writings. It's historians' books that have written about the connections between Barbados and the Caribbean, or the connection between the British Empire. The other thing is that there's a legal trade going on between the islands, so people are brought from place to place. So you don't even necessarily, it's not necessarily as anchored as you might think at times either. You may have a history that gets blended into that. What you wind up using for some of that is it's just like with records in the South. You try to find the location and the enslaver, and then the lists of records for ownership of enslaved people, then work on that to kind of tease that out. It's not easy. As you know, it takes 4 times longer to do this kind of research than it does for a lot of European
Yes.
research.
Yes.
What I can say about Barbados, because I've literally just started looking into those record sets, the historians and the kind of archivist librarians that I've been contacting there have been so incredibly welcoming and helpful.
Wow.
And their lookup fees are like nominal. Like we're talking about $2.50,
What?
$5.
Wow, that's
$5
wonderful.
to do lookups.
What?
So really, really good. Now, Ellen, I have an analogy for you that's going to lead into a question.
Sure.
So, okay, I'm thinking Louisiana, which is culturally a very different part than the rest of British-controlled colonies in the United States. So, their records are kind of organized by parishes, and their legal system is different. Their kind of record sets are slightly different. There's some parity with British colonies, but there's also some unique differences too.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of Puerto Rico, how were those records kind of organized, and kind of, do Puerto Rico have, or does it have, like parishes or their counties?
They're basically broken down into districts and then municipalities. And there's 70 today. There's 78 municipalities, and as further back you go in time, these areas have become progressively larger subdivisions. Like you'll learn, there's other people that have like lists of when these borders change on the island. Like at the beginning, it was San Juan Bautista, and then it became San Germán and San Juan, and then that broke down to Aguada, San Juan, and a couple of other areas, and that continued to happen. There's record sets is very uneven and kind of spotty for certain time periods. Like there's a thing we call it el hueco, which is like the hole, like if it was a pothole, where you hit like the early 19th century, you may have that first book of marriages or deaths, the parish records, and then there's no book two. The stuff from 1800 is not there. So what do? There's workaround for that. But if you know that you have fairly recent Puerto Rican ancestry, basically what you start with is a civil registration. And a lot of this has to do with empire and how do they keep track of people, because that's really what it's about. It's about extractive economies and knowing how to get stuff out of there, so they want to know who is where. So there's, censuses are numeric until later. There are the church and the church and state. It's one, So those parish records early on is what you use, and then after that, around the 1870s, 1880s, and this is dependent on what islands you're talking about too. You're going to have the start of the civil registration system, which is your system of your birth, marriages, and death vital records, which is a little different than the parish records.
So when did slavery start being, when was that phased out in Spanish-held territories like Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Cuba?
Each island has like different years for it. Mm-hmm. And in Cuba, it's not until 1886, which is terribly late. And then in Puerto Rico, it's 1873 is when emancipation is given, but it's actually more like akin to a gradual emancipation, because people had to work for no pay for 3 years, and then they're working for this. They're basically in the same situation for 3 years,
But it was known that they had to do that. It was because our families.
Sure, it's just I just mentioned it because a lot of times people will mention, Dia de Emancipación, it's this date in 1873, and it's kind of like, but wait, pull back a little bit. I mean, this is a longer process, and it's not quite as people aren't exactly getting integrated into society. Like some of the research I've done, I found like before then, most people who are being freed, it's because they're paying for their freedom. It's not because their owner decided that, this is really, I shouldn't be doing this, I'm going to let you go. It wasn't like that, It really is a question about holding on to your business investment as long as possible.
So what is the difference between African American research and Latino and Puerto Rican and Caribbean research? Like what? Because it's so far what you're saying. It literally was the same thing. We had the same issues. As far as
it is a lot, and I think a lot of people think that it's going to be like wildly different. But a lot of this system had a lot of interlocking parts, and in order that to work, it's not going to be a bunch of different things. So, I think that's part of the reason why there's so much. There's more overlap than people might think for that.
Wow, that's amazing, because I think I look at people of color, no matter what color, and they don't realize the actual kinship that they have with each other until you start talking about stuff like this. Like you was explaining, the 1873 is when emancipation came, as far as there was concerned, and it was 65 for us, or 63 for us 10 years prior. But you guys had the opportunity to know that, okay, for these first 3 years, you still have to work, and you're working for free, whereas we weren't told that.
No.
Right.
You know,
Right.
we weren't given that. We weren't even given that information, but yet it still gave the same outcome. It's still,
Right.
you know, and I didn't know that. I'm fascinated by what you're saying. I didn't know that.
The other thing I found really shocking, I've been involved in this project that I transcribed these cedulas for this missing volume of the Registro de Esclavos, and I was really shocked to find that nearly half the people listed in these certificates were children, you know, and a good percentage were infants, and I mean children under the age of 3, which is just raises even more questions about what exactly was going on. You know, this is
Wow.
So a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned something about workarounds, which I like to spend a couple of minutes on, because
Sure.
those are the kinds of things that our audience really tunes in for.
Yes.
Any of those kind of tips or tricks. So one of the workarounds that Donnie and I have is, because we spend so much time researching our ancestors, we understand what the naming conventions were within each family. So we can see a name like Georgiana, and we're like, oh, she's going to be a Peterson.
Without a doubt.
She's going to be a Holloway. Or we see the name Alonso, and we know that's going to go back to the Settles. So I understand there's probably a little complexity with the Spanish kind of naming, because I understand the practice was you have both your mother's maiden name and your father's maiden name. So
Right.
just kind of talking about maybe a little bit about naming conventions, and then some of the other workarounds that people can use when the records just don't exist.
Well, one of the problems, of course, with enslavement is that, you know, they're erasing your identity, or they're assigning you an identity, and you don't necessarily have the surname. Although there was a small number of people that did have surnames in these slave certificates, but not everyone. So the records really that record sets to really work with are church records. I mean, if you get to this point, but if there also have people that served in the military, people of color served in the military. So you'll have people that were of indigenous ancestry and African ancestry who were in special, what do you call it, regiments, I guess, that were part of the militia, you know. And they're militia lists, but these date from about 1817 and 1819. And there's a lot of transcription work that was done by the Sociedad Puertorriqueña de Genealogía, which is based in San Juan, and they have a journal called Hereditas they publish, and they also publish a lot of really amazing books. Like, let me just show you this one.
Wow.
I don't know if you could see this.
Come
Let
over
me
just
see.
a little. There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a list of, the aportación de las naciones africanas a la familia puertorriqueña, and it's a list that's divided between people with the owner's name or another surname and where they turn up. So it's kind of like these mini bios that are in here.
So
Most of the
age
people I
feels
transcribe are not in here, but that's
so basically what it sounds like is
it's a great start. You know?
What it sounds like is because Edgefield has a book like that called the Edgefield Slave Record Book, where it gives information about the owner and the
Right.
new owner and the cost and a brief description of the enslaved person, or something to that nature. That's what that sounds like. So you guys have a book like that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I mean, this is done by the society, and there's a bunch of different. I mean, it's all over the island. It's
Wow.
not just one location. Yeah. And then there are like essays in the beginning, and of course, this is entirely in Spanish, but you could still, it's still something to work with. I'm trying to think of something else. Go ahead.
And I was going to ask you a question about, say, Puerto Rican or Dominican online research communities. I mean, can you find them on? So, say, for instance, you're just dipping your toes, or you've been doing your research for a little while. Is there like an online community that can offer advice, offer support, guidance?
Yeah, there are. There are Dominican groups on Facebook. There's also the CUNY Dominican Institute in New York City, which has, it kind of gives you an overview and also has different documents at the end that you can look at. The Dominican Republic has record sets that go back to the 1720s, I believe, to the 1924s that are on Family Search. So different people work with that, and it's also in contrast to like doing like Haitian genealogy as well. There's also the Dominican Genealogical Society also publishes a journal, which is in Spanish, which is online. And so there are resources out there. You know, it's just that they're not necessarily all in one place. And a lot of it really depends on what you're really looking at, you know, because if it turns out that, you know, your Dominican ancestor is actually only from the 1940s and from New York, or from, you know, another state, and then you have to look into those migrations, or look into the military, or look into which is another, you know, another thing to consider.
So you mentioned something about Family Search. So if I'm on Google and I'm curious about what record sets Family Search has, I would just type in Family Search, comma, Puerto Rican records, or like a search string like that. You know, it's funny. It's like I'm not 100% sure if you'll get to it from the outside, because you do need to have an account for Family Search. You know, and then once, and the account is free, right? But once you go in there, then you can go in the catalog. And what I like to do too is just to put the location and just see what comes up, and see what they have. And then because of it, some things too, there's that cutoff with more recent records because of privacy issues. So like for Puerto Rico, like you won't find necessarily births after 1935, you know, but their project stopped in 1990 or 1970 because they were filming in the 1990s. I mean, that's kind of like where that wall is, where like if they were doing it now, there'd probably be more the 40s in there even. So
it sounds like Puerto Rican and Caribbean, like their census. Were you able to find anybody in your family in 1870 and 1880, or did yours start literally 1910?
Well, that's talking about the U.S. invasion of Puerto Rico and their colonization of the island, and then they're bringing their census techniques to the island.
Okay.
So if you look before, there are some older books that are about the census records of Latin America by George Platt, older books like that, which some of them you could find on the BYU library. They have some island guides on there that you could look at, which are real basic, but they give you the record sets and they kind of tell you what's available and what's not. I mean, it's up to you to go digging in there because it's a ton of stuff, but you know, at least you're going in with kind of a map to work with, you know, of what exactly you can find.
And I have to ask this question, because Puerto Rico has suffered horribly with hurricanes over the last hurricane season. Has that, to your knowledge, has that had any effect on were any records destroyed or lost?
My understanding is that there have been some losses, but that hasn't really come out. And then there's been a real problem just with getting funding from the United States for hurricane damage and things. So that's a really horrible situation. It continues. I mean, I think they're still sitting on like a chunk of money that hasn't been released, and it's 2 years later.
Wow.
So you also had a problem with cemeteries being destroyed or being put in terrible condition, like the one in Lattes. They actually had the coffins coming out and floating in the waters. I mean, there were it's kind of like New Orleans. What happened with New Orleans is very much like that, you know, where you just kind of leave people high and dry.
So now you've got me thinking, because I didn't even think about cemeteries.
I didn't think about that.
That means churches. Churches
were destroyed.
Think about all the church records.
Yeah, and all the church records and things.
So the church records weren't necessarily destroyed. I mean, there's the issue, like talking just Puerto Rico. I don't know about the other islands, but in Puerto Rico, there was a thing about who opted in and who opted out of having their records microfilmed by Family Search. So there were some places didn't do it. So then there's a real concern, like, to get those books, because it isn't like you have the condition, a climate controlled environment, ideally to preserve records. You don't really have that so much there, especially if you're talking about places with a smaller population or not as many resources. And those resources, people get angry, and then I try to remind them, hey, they're not there for genealogists first. They're there for the communities first. And then, if they can do something about the records, they will. So the Sociedad Puertorriqueña de Genealogía has a project where a lot of the older volumes have been collected, and they're in a process of digitization. But it's not clear how long that's going to take or where that's happening. I'm not sure exactly where that is, although it's ongoing.
Well, we have a question from Shelley Murphy, and I think it's going back to when you were talking about the status of, whether a person was free or how they were, how they actually after the emancipation. Basically, it was saying, she said, can you pay for your family status, or is that the same as paying for freedom?
That would be paying for your freedom. And I was really amazed by the amounts of money, because people, these are in notarial documents. And in Puerto Rico, notarial documents are considered to be living documents still. And I'm talking about stuff that's already almost 200 years old. So that starts to beg the question of at what point do you liberate these things so that people can work with them more readily? But I don't know that that's necessarily going to happen. But these records have, there was someone who published a book and published several books of these notarial records, and I extracted the ones dealing with, in one box, dealing with slavery. And I was just really amazed to see that people were collecting something like 300 pesos macuquinos, a silver money, to pay for their freedom or their child's freedom, and then the notarial record becomes, that would be another repository to have that you're somewhere, but your freedom would be inscribed. There's probably additional documentation for these things, which I'm not sure about, but yeah, a lot of it. But the other thing this is the point with that, is that it belies community ties, It's really hard. I mean, you're talking about a place where money was scarce to begin with, okay? So this person is not working by themselves. That's really a lot of people pushing to get this freedom. It's a lot of collaboration.
Which kind of begs the question, especially for if your status was that of a slave, how did you even earn the money to be able to buy not only your freedom but other family members' freedoms?
Right. It would be the renting out, just like stateside, where people would be renting out their labor, and if they got to sell something extra that they made or they grew, getting money from that. Yeah. Because people are regarded like a wallet, and it's kind of like when they would say, I read a Southern account that said, "Master has me in my pocket." It has me in his pocket. Like they're looking at you like currency.
So one of the other questions I have is, what's one of the more memorable or kind of amazing stories that you found in your ancestry? And if you can talk a little bit about maybe some of the record sets that you accessed to investigate that.
In my own ancestry, I'm just thinking about a photograph that I bought in Aguadilla that was from 1939, and it had a little heading at the bottom, and it was from the town where my mother was born, and I looked at it and I kept thinking, like, God, the dates here. There's a coffin there. There's these guys lined up. I have a blog post on this, and I was able to identify most of the people in the photograph. Showed the date in the photograph was wrong. Have a map to show that how far it was from where that photograph was taken to the cemetery, which was down the street. And then I believe that my great-grandfather was even in that photo, which there's no photos of him as a young man, but I believe it's him because both he and my great-grandfather, because they both made coffins. and they're listed as coffin makers in the 1940 census. So it was just kind of surprising. There was one woman that I traced from her freedom into the 1940s, and she had changed her name 5 times, but I was able to track her through these different census records and stuff, and see that, you know, her life was pretty different.
Wow.
You know.
Well, we can definitely relate to ancestors
Yes.
who have more than
Changing
one
of the
name.
names is something else. So, Anessa asked 2 questions. The first one was for me. The title of the book at Edgefield was Slave Records of Edgefield County. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the slave records of Edgefield County, and you can purchase it through the Old Edgefield District and Genealogical Society. And then she had a question for you about the title of the book that you actually held up, and is it purchasable?
I believe so. You have to go to, I believe it's prgenealogy.com is the SPG's website. And then if it's available, it should be listed. They have some books for sale listed on their website.
And what's the name of it again?
It's called, it's the 3rd volume, Colección de Genealogía e Historia, la aportación de las naciones africanas a la familia puertorriqueña.
Yeah,
it's basically the contribution of the African nations to the Puerto Rican family is basically the title of it.
Okay, we're gonna need you to send that to us. That
Sure.
way I can put it on the...
I know, it's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is. That way I can put it on the comments and people can look for that book. That's awesome. So, you had another question, or can I go ahead? What have you done? Have you written any books or outside of your blogs or things?
It's a blog, yeah. My blog is latinogenealogy.com. Although if you look for me online, you'll probably find my other older blogs that I had before, Fernandez Family History and Babylonia Family History. And I started out with those before building my own website and kind of putting there, because I don't know if you've noticed, but like with some of the free sites, they keep stripping the functionality from it. So the next time you think you can do something more with it, you can't. And then it was like, oh no, I just, want to be able to put what I want on there. And so, yes, I came up with Latino Genealogy and Beyond, which has, I'm not sure how many articles. I think I'm going into my 3rd year with it. And I'm hoping that I can use some of the blog posts, which some people have told me read like a book. Like it's as long like a book because they just scrolling. So like I'm trying to do shorter blog posts, but yeah. So that's but I have published articles, and I've published articles in Hereditas, and I have a web page on academia.edu under my name, and people can download the articles there for free. So they're available. Wow. And I've also published with the California Nugget. I did work also on eugenics and the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition. I've done an article on slavery and revisiting slavery on the Babylonia family, which is a 2-part article that was first I published in the Baobab Tree. And then I published it in the California Nugget, and there's copies of that available if people want to download that.
So I was going to come to your defense about long posts, because again, we have a cousin called Melvin Collier. He's just written an amazing blog post. About how he found family, members of his extended family that were split apart during slavery.
Yeah.
And there is no way on earth that he could have ever written that in like 500 words or less.
No.
You couldn't.
There's
too many moving parts. You have to explain terminology and explain how some things worked and actually step people through your methodology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't just say, oh yeah, I found this person and that's it. I mean, it's just not even possible. You have to explain. I mean, I think the beauty of genealogical research or researching as a whole when your family is the actual process to finding them. And it is in that process that I don't know about you guys, but I start to find me. Like I have found myself so many times in doing this particular research and sitting here and just saying, "Oh my God, is this what that is? Oh my God, did I? What? I said that before," or just different things, and you start to learn, and you want to share. You want people to know and actually understand how you felt when you actually found the things that you found. So with that being said, why haven't you written a book yet, Ellen?
It's a good question. No, it's kind of like I got the blog. These like some of them are insanely long blog posts out, but I keep thinking like, well, what is the, what would it be? And I think it would be that the common theme would be Mocha, which is on the west side of the island, because that's kind of what a lot of the work that I've done hubs out of, and that's not to limit it to that, because it's there's a lot of consideration to, the landscape, maps, different types of record sets, oral histories, photographs, and photographs is hard because there's a lot of photographs I think that are lost, or that you don't really have them unless you're talking about the 1940s and people would go to the fairs that they would have for the saints at certain times of the year, and then a guy would have a kiosk, and then somebody could afford to get like a little photograph of their family and stuff. It wasn't really common until a bit later,
Well, another question that I have, because we take American records for granted, things like enslavers' wills and estate inventories and deeds of sales. I would say, to what extent did people say enslavers in Puerto Rico, what were their wills like and their estate inventories, and are things like deeds of sale, do those still exist?
Yes, very much so. But they're categorized. They're organized chronologically, but then underneath the notary that the family would have used. So there's an index for the notaries, and then you could find, you go through that and you'd find that. But then there was an issue with using the records at the Archivo General de Puerto Rico, because you need like at least 3 days, before you can actually see the record. You got to go register, then you got to go say, I want this and that, and then they make you come back before they actually give you access. And then even then you're writing this thing out by hand, on pencil and paper, so it's not a quick process. And I'm really curious if there might be some release of that. But there is Don Carlos Encarnacion Navarro, who published a book of these protocolos notariales, and it's pretty amazing, because if it isn't for that, a lot of times you can't find the family groups. You do have the 1826 and then an 1852 slave inventories that were taken on the island according to the law. And every time something would happen, and then something in terms of like people are pushing for their rights, and there becomes a change in the law, and then you could read that law and then see what the specifics were for that, so that you could see that they ordered that a census would be done. And some of those are done for different parts of the island, but not all of them have necessarily survived.
Okay, and I'm assuming, again, like here, when there's enslaved people, there will be family members who will fight over who got what enslaved person. So there are lawsuits.
There are lawsuits.
Same thing for Puerto Rico?
I think that also plays out in the notarial documents too. I don't know if they necessarily would go to court for it, but they would. Most of the documents I've seen concern inheritances and sales, and sometimes the ship owners, which I wonder, if that's involved as well. Sometimes that doesn't really come up in there.
So one of the things so Barbados, certain Caribbean islands were a part of the transatlantic slave trade. Do you have a lot of information dating back that far in those areas? And do you find that it's better to actually be in those areas to do the research than to research them online?
Actually, right now, if you're talking about the Bahamas and Puerto Rico, you're probably better off doing online research. I mean, it's just difficult. I mean, after Maria, I don't know about the conditions on how if Barbados was impacted. But if you can, like Brian was saying, you're in contact with staff at these different archives, that would be a way to find out. But the other thing is that there's a lot of imperative right now to have digitized records available, because the more copies, the more chances something will survive. So I think that's something to consider too. I mean, there's way more that I can do in family search than I can trying to get records in Puerto Rico. It's not that accessible a process.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and sharing your time with this on this Sunday.
Yes, this went past so fast.
It did. I thought there was going to be more time.
I know. I'm so we're gonna have to have you back, because
Sure.
this is such a. I mean,
This is a common theme for us for the last month and a half. We
we've
come out of the show going, there's so many more questions.
and then we're at a point now, especially with this particular type of research, because again, as when I first contacted you, I wanted you to to really know and understand that we try to cover minority research. It's not that we don't do European research. We have to, because we know that we're connected via European as well. But we want to focus on the minority research, because so many people have so many problems trying to find their other halves. So that's why I was so excited to be able to get in contact with you and to know that you would be able to do it, and then to learn that you was at once on Black Pro Gen Live and everything. So one more time before we close out, I want you to just give some information how somebody can contact you, and we're going to have you back on the show.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I've got my blog, Latino Genealogy and Beyond. You can drop me a line there. I don't know, can I say my email address or no? Or
No, we don't want you to do that.
Okay. But I'm not really. I don't think I'm hard to find.
Okay.
Well, again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We are the last show broadcasting from Listen Vision Studio. Do check out their website, listenvisionlive.com.
Yes.
We've got some great programming on the website.
Yes, they do. They do. Well, thank you again, Ellen, for being
Oh,
here.
you're so welcome.
And we would like to see you again, and we will let you guys know Tuesday or Wednesday, like we've been doing, what our next show is. And we thank you so much for following and just being such strong supporters. I want y'all to ask more questions, please. We get these people and they want to help, and we want to help you guys. So let's get your questions up. Let's get them up.
Absolutely. And until next week, enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes. Goodbye. Have a good day, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Ellen.
Bye, Ellen. And thank you again.
You're welcome.